Good morning. Welcome back to another section of women's writing. We are going through the third chapter, Shakespeare's sister, in Virginia Woolf's very famous essay, A Room of One's Own. Virginia Woolf was disappointed when she went through the history to collect the details of women. She didn't find out at least a word by a woman in Elizabethan period. Most of the men wrote poems, sonnets, plays. Then what happened to women? So she decided to collect the living conditions of women in that era. She assumed a living conditions of a woman should have a connection with her creativity. Woolf says fiction is like a spider's web. It is still attached to life at all four corners. Then she is speaking about Shakespeare's works. So we can identify that Shakespeare's characters are not imaginary creatures. Through his works, he speaks about the suffering of human beings and grossly material things like health and money and the houses we live in. Woolf examined History of England by Trevelyan. She was astonished by wife beating. Women were controlled by their parents till their marriage. Parents were selected the partners for their daughters without their consent. Marriage and divorces were recorded in history. But in literature, women were created as powerful characters. We have already mentioned the strong characters in fiction in our previous class. But in real life, they were locked up, beaten and flung about the room. Woolf says women dominate lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. But in fact, she was the slave of anybody who exchanged a ring with her. Her parents were chosen her husband without her consent. So she was forced to accept the person as her husband. Some of the most inspired words and the most profound thoughts in literature fall from their lips. But in real life, she was not able to read, spell and write. She was just the property of her husband. In fiction, she had her own identity. She was narrated with her name, age, dressing style, etc. But in history, she was avoided. That's why Woolf decided to find the answer why Trevelyan wrote History of England. Actually, all these points we went through in our last class. Why Trevelyan wrote History of England without adding all the details in that era. So all of you please take the page number 6. Today we are continuing with the third paragraph in page number 6. History for him consists of many movements and wars where men are involved. The manor court and the method of open field agriculture, the Cistercians and sheep farming, the Crusades, the University, the House of Commons, the 100 Years' War, the origin of English sea power, the Armada, and so on. So, Virginia Woolf starts to go through the history of England. Then she can see that a lot of movements and wars. What was the speciality of these wars and movements? We can see that men are involved in all these movements and wars. We can think that Trevelyan wrote the history of men, not women. We can also call it as a gender discrimination because he gave importance to men. Occasionally, a woman is mentioned, an Elizabeth or a Mary, and there ends the history of women. Did he avoid women in history? Occasionally, a woman is mentioned, an Elizabeth or Mary, and there ends the history of women. These women belong to high class family. No middle class women who were very intelligent and good were mentioned in these history books. This woman who has only brains and character has not kept any record of her existence. No plays or poems, no anecdotes or diary entries. No history of such a woman existed. We can say that Trevelyan avoided women completely in history of England. He also wrote occasionally about a woman. He wrote about a Elizabeth or a Mary. But we can't get extra details of any other woman except Elizabeth or Mary. Elizabeth and Mary belonged to high class family. Then what about middle class women? He didn't mention about middle class women. Middle class women who were very intelligent and good were mentioned in these history books. They have also brains and character, but they haven't recorded in history. So she started to examine plays, poems, anecdotes and diary entries. But she didn't get any details about middle class women in plays, poems, anecdotes and also diary entries. So we can see that no history of such a woman existed. Woolf started to think it very seriously how to solve this problem. How we can add the details of middle class woman in history. Woolf also suggests the students of Newham and Girton colleges to supply such a history where women had a role. They should collect a mass of information like at what age did she marry, how many children she had she a room to herself, did she do the cooking or did she have a servant, and so on. So Woolf suggests the students of Newham and Girton colleges definitely we should record a history for women. She also supplies a questionnaire. In that questionnaire we can see that the questions like these. At what age did she marry? She wanted to know the exact age which woman married. How many children she had? Had she a room to herself? Did she do the cooking or did she have a servant? Like that, she made a questionnaire. All these account of an average Elizabethan woman would be scattered somewhere. The students should find it and bring it to the limelight and supplement the existing male-dominated history with a women's history. Definitely we will get the details of an average Elizabethan woman. It would be scattered somewhere. She knows it very well the students from Newham and Girton colleges, they are very brilliant and smart. They can collect all these information. So Woolf suggests them we should publish women's history with the existing male dominated history. When we go through the history of England, we can easily understand the dominating power of men in history. So she suggests the students we should publish the history of women with the existing male dominated history. Woolf also reminds us we have lives enough of Jane Austen. We should be ready to consider again the influence of the tragedies of Joanna Baillie upon the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. We don't forget that homes and haunts of Mary Russell Mitford were closed to the public for a century at least. Woolf analyzes women's struggle as artists, their position in literary history, and their need for independence through these lines. Woolf also reminds us we should think about Jane Austen. Who is Jane Austen? I think if you are very familiar with Jane Austen, she is an English novelist. Her famous work is Pride and Prejudice. She also reminds us we should consider the influence of the tragedies of Joanna Baillie. Joanna Baillie, she is a Scottish poet and dramatist. She also speaks about the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is American author, poet, editor, literary critic. She also tells us we don't forget the life of Mary Russell Mitford. Her homes and resorts were closed to the public for a century at least. Why Woolf spoke about Jane Austen, Joanna Baillie, Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Russell Mitford. Actually, through these writers, Woolf wants to remind us women's struggles as artists, how they acquired the position in literary history. We don't forget their struggle as artists and how they achieved their position in literary history. Nothing is known about women before the 18th century. Woolf inquires into the state of women in the Elizabethan era. We already knew that actually she examined the history before 200 years in the Stuart, but she didn't get any details about women. So she wanted to collect at least the details of women in the golden era. Why did not any woman produce a poem? Why did she do from morning to night? Were they educated? Did they have sitting rooms for themselves? How many women had children before they were 21? For collecting the details of Elizabethan women, she asked a lot of questions. Why any woman didn't write a poem? How did she spend her entire day? Did she get the education? Did she have her own private room? How many women became mother before they were 21? Like that, she added so many questions. These women had no money and they were married off at an early age itself. It would have been quite odd to know that Shakespeare's plays were written by a woman. She can very easily identify the fact that women had no money and they were married at an early age. Why they didn't have money? Because they didn't get the proper education. If they educated well, they would earn money. They would not marry at their tender age. At the same time, she also understood Shakespeare's plays were written by a woman. How it happened? Even women were not at all educated in this period. Then how a woman can write the plays of Shakespeare? തീർത്തും വിചിത്രമായൊരു കാര്യം അല്ലേ? വിദ്യാഭ്യാസം നിഷേധിക്കപ്പെട്ട, സ്വന്തമായി ഒന്നിനും തീരുമാനമെടുക്കാൻ സാധിക്കാത്ത സമൂഹത്തിൽ സ്ത്രീകൾ ജീവിച്ചിരുന്ന കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഒരു സ്ത്രീ ഷേക്സ്പിയറുടേതായിട്ടുള്ള പ്ലേസ് എഴുതിയത്? ആരായിരിക്കും ആ സ്ത്രീ? അവർക്ക് എങ്ങനെ അത് സാധിച്ചു? ഡെഫിനറ്റ്ലി ഷി ഹാഡ് ഓൾസോ എ ലോട്ട് ഓഫ് ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ്. ഷി ഫെൽറ്റ് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് വെരി സ്ട്രേഞ്ച്. Woolf quotes a bishop who had once declared that it was impossible for any woman, past, present or future, to have the genius of Shakespeare. Woolf concludes that paragraph by adding a bishop's quote. That bishop declared that it was impossible for any woman in this world to write like the great Shakespeare in past, present or future. He challenged the entire woman in this world. He states that a woman can't write just like Shakespeare in past, present and also in future. Maybe this quote of bishop struck in Virginia Woolf. It would have been impossible. The narrator concludes from this thought experiment completely and entirely. For any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. To illustrate this conclusion, she conjures the imaginary character of Judith Shakespeare. I already told you, Woolf starts to think about Bishop's quote. Is it possible? A woman can write like the great Shakespeare. Maybe it is impossible. She starts to think a woman in the age of Shakespeare can write the plays like him. Is it possible? At that moment, she conjures the imaginary character of Judith Shakespeare. What it means conjures? Make something appear magic. ഭൂതത്തിലും വർത്തമാനത്തിലും ഭാവിയിലും ഒരു സ്ത്രീക്കും മഹാനായ ഷേക്സ്പിയറെ പോലെ എഴുതാൻ സാധിക്കില്ല എന്ന ബിഷപ്പിൻ്റെ കണ്ടെത്തലിനെ വൂൾഫ് ഒരുപാട് നേരം ആലോചിച്ചു. അതിനൊരു സമാപ്തിയായിട്ടാണ് അവരുടെ മനസ്സിൽ ഒരു മാജിക് എന്ന വണ്ണം ഒരു കഥാപാത്രം രൂപം കൊണ്ടത്. ആ കഥാപാത്രമാണ് നമ്മുടെ ഈ ചാപ്റ്ററിൻ്റെ ടൈറ്റിൽ തന്നെ, ഷേക്സ്പിയർസ് സിസ്റ്റർ. She created an imaginary character Woolf also named that character Judith Shakespeare. Then we are going to speak about the life of Judith Shakespeare. Before starting the life of Judith Shakespeare, we should speak about Shakespeare. Shakespeare himself went very probably. His mother was an heiress, the grammar school. So, Shakespeare may have learned grammar and logic. He got the opportunity to know about Ovid. She imagines Shakespeare studied grammar and logic. There is a specific reason. What is the reason? Because Shakespeare's mother was an heiress. What it is heiress? Heiress means a woman who is legally entitled to the property. Shakespeare's mother had a grammar school. That's why Woolf says Shakespeare may have learned grammar and logic. He got the opportunity to know about Ovid, Virgil, and Horace. Shakespeare got the opportunity to know about the Roman poets. Ovid, his full name is Publius Ovidius Naso. He was a Roman poet, popularly known for his work Metamorphoses. Virgil, Publius Virgilius Maro. He was a classical Roman poet well known for his work The Aeneid. Horace, Quintus Horatius Flaccus, was the Roman lyric poet during the time of Augustus Caesar. Shakespeare got the opportunity to know about Ovid, Virgil, and Horace. He started to read the books of these three Roman poets. Shakespeare got the freedom to poach rabbits and shot a deer. He married a woman in the neighborhood. Then he went to London to seek his fortune. So we can see that Shakespeare got the education. He had the freedom to poach rabbits and shot a deer. What is the meaning of poach? Poach means cook without its shell in boiling water. Shakespeare enjoyed his life. He got the proper education. He had the freedom to enjoy his life. He was interested to poach rabbits and shot deer. He had the freedom to marry a woman in the neighborhood. After that, he wanted to seek his fortune. That's why he went to London. Why he went to London? He had the taste for the theatre. At first, he got the job to hold horses at the stage door. Very soon, he got work in the theatre, became a successful actor. He had the freedom to live at the center of the universe and even succeed to enter in the palace of the queen. He went to London because he had the taste for the theatre. When he reached there, at first he got the job to hold horses at the stage door. After that, he got work in the theatre. At first he worked outside the theatre at the stage door. Later he got the work in the theatre. After that he became a successful actor. We can see that he had the freedom to live at the center of the universe. He had the freedom to travel, to stay anywhere he wanted. Finally, he also succeeded to enter in the palace of the queen because he was very famous for his works. So he got the direct entry in the palace of the queen. So I think all of you got the life of Shakespeare. Well, why Woolf speaks about the life of Shakespeare? അല്ലേ, ജൂഡിത്ത് ഷേക്സ്പിയറിനെ പറ്റിയിട്ടാണ് പറയാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നത്. പിന്നെ എന്താണ് പെട്ടെന്ന് ഷേക്സ്പിയറിൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിനെ പറ്റി വിവരിച്ചത്? There is a specific reason. Then only she can speak about the life of Judith Shakespeare. What happened in the life of Judith Shakespeare? Judith is gifted perhaps as her brother, but receives no education except that which she can create for herself in what free time she has. She was remained at home. She was as adventurous as imaginative as Agog to see the world as he was. Judith Shakespeare is also very gifted child like her brother. But you know, she didn't get the proper education. She was not allowed to go to school. Because of her talent, she studied a lot by herself. She was forced to spend the time at home. She wanted to enjoy the adventurous, imaginative and excited world like her brother Shakespeare. But she didn't get the permission. She was forced to spend the time at home. She didn't get the freedom like her brother. She was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic. She didn't get the chance to read Ovid, Virgil and Horace. She writes some in secret but hides or burns her work for fear of revenge. Her parents reminded her to mend the stockings or cook the dishes and not moon about with books and papers. I already told you she didn't get the freedom like her brother. She didn't get the chance to go to school. She was not able to study grammar and logic. She didn't get the chance to go through the works of Ovid, Virgil and Horace. But she was very talented like her brother. When she writes something, she kept it as secret. She started to burn her own work because for fear of revenge. When the parents would see her writings, they would punish her. Because of this fear, she burned all her writings. Her parents always reminded her, as a woman you can mend the stockings, you can prepare the dishes, but you should not walk with the books and papers. It's not your world. Parents would have spoken sharply but kindly. Although she is the apple of her father's eye, her family expects her to obey to a social role that leaves no room for the development of her talent. We can see that parents, they use the very sharp words, but at the same time they were very kind too. They loved their daughter very deeply, but at the same time they expected their daughter should obey the social role. They are afraid of society. That's why the parents were not at all ready to give a room for her on. They couldn't encourage her to develop her creativity. You don't forget that Judith Shakespeare, she is the sister of the great Shakespeare. She becomes engaged at a young age. She was to be betrothed, the son of a neighboring wool stapler. When she begs to be allowed not to marry, she is scolded and beaten by her father. Then we can see that she becomes engaged at her young age. Her marriage was fixed with the son of a neighboring wool stapler. Wool stapler means buy wool from a producer and sells to a manufacturer. She begged her parents. She is not at all ready to marry at her younger age. As the result, she was scolded and beaten by her father. After this, she runs away, driven by the force of her own gift alone. She wants to go into acting. She has the taste for the theatre, but meets with rejection and ridicule. Finally, Judith Shakespeare runs away from her home. Because of her talent, she was forced to run away from her own home. She had the taste for theatre like her brother Shakespeare. Somehow she reached in England. But what happened? She started to seek the role in theatre, but nobody helped her. They started to reject her, and also they started to ridicule her. They started to laugh at her. She is finally taken up by a theatre manager. He is Nick Green. He befriends her, and very soon she finds herself pregnant and commits suicide one winter's night. She is buried at some crossroads where the omnibuses now stop outside the Elephant and Castle. When Judith Shakespeare was rejected and ridiculed by others, she is finally taken up by a theatre manager. His name is Nick Green. Very soon, both of them became good friends. She also finds out the reality: she is pregnant. Actually, the theatre manager, Nick Green, he was not helping her. The theatre manager, Nick Green, was a fraud. She already understood she was cheated by Nick Green. So she committed suicide. She was buried at some crossroads where the omnibuses now stop outside the Elephant and Castle. It is a major road intersection in South London. She didn't get any appreciation as a talented person. Her body was buried outside the Elephant and Castle. As the female-dominated society could hardly accept both women's independence and her creativity, Judith sadly ends up committing suicide, and a genius is never given a chance and talent is nipped in the bud. When we go through the life of Judith Shakespeare, we can see that the male-dominated society, they will never accept both women's freedom and her creativity. Here, Judith Shakespeare, she was a talented woman, but she was forced to commit suicide. The society never gives a chance to her. Her talent was nipped in the bud. She didn't get the chance to express her talent. Before that, she was exploited. സാങ്കല്പിക കഥാപാത്രമായിട്ടുള്ള ജൂഡിത്ത് ഷേക്സ്പിയറിന് എന്താണ് സംഭവിച്ചതെന്ന് നിങ്ങൾ ഓരോരുത്തർക്കും മനസ്സിലായെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കണം. Today we covered till the last paragraph in page number 8. I hope you walked with me. All of you should read the textbook well. We will continue this chapter in our next class. Thank you.